The apocalypse has a new address. Atomfall throws you into a quarantined wasteland brimming with danger, promising a desperate fight for survival. But after sinking over 10 hours into this radioactive landscape, scavenging for scraps, and facing down everything from mutated creatures to rogue robots, the question remains, is Atomfall a true test of survival or something else entirely? So I've been diving deep into Atomfall, approaching it with hardened eyes of a survival game enthusiast. Today, we're going to dissect its mechanics, its promises, and ultimately whether or not it earns the coveted survival tag. Atomfall steps into the scene draped in the familiar banners of the post-apocalypse and the rugged appeal of an open-world survival. The checklist seems complete. A world ravaged by some unknown event, the need to craft essential gear, the thrill of unearthing hidden treasures with a metal detector, facing off against many enemy threats, from feral ghoul-like creatures and desperate bands to menacing robots and even rogue-like soldiers. We're promised a functional bartering system, the need to scavenge for every advantage, and even status elements that hint at a struggle for existence. Eating scavenged food replenishes your health, a seemingly fundamental aspect of survival. However, as we look closer at the checklist items, the reality of Atomfall's survival elements begin to feel different. While yes, it does certainly borrow ingredients from the survival genre, the final game feels distinctly more like an open-world crafting RPG, and my central argument is this. The survival aspects in Atomfall often feel like a complementary addition, a backdrop per se, to the core experience, rather than relentless demanding core experience itself, or even being part of the game as a essential survival element. But how did I come to this conclusion? Let's kick things off with the very playground we're meant to survive in, the open world. Now, while Atomfall presents a sizable map with distinct zones to explore, it doesn't quite deliver that seamless, sprawling experience many open world survival fans might expect. Instead of a truly contiguous landscape, you'll discover large explorable segments that are separated by loading screens or instant jumps. Think of them as interconnected but distinct areas, and while these zones are often visually striking, i.e., the decaying beauty of overgrown ruins, the eerie silence of abandoned buildings, and the caves' bunkers are fully flushed out and are generally well crafted. However, the feeling of a truly massive interconnected world does take a hit. A great example of this break in the open world is the village store, for example. Instead of simply walking to the storefronts within the game and going to trade, you're whisked away to a separate instance with a loading screen. It's a functional system with a quick loading screens in between these instances, which is great, but it feels immersion breaking and an older generation game feeling. However, despite some of the open world quirks, Atomfall does introduce some genuinely engaging mechanics. Let's talk about the bartering system. This wasn't just a simple press X to trade a fare. Instead, you're presented with a two-sided scale. To make a successful trade, you need to offer items that balance the scales or even tip them slightly in the trader's favor. What made the system particularly interesting was the varying value different traders placed on goods. One might be desperate for medical supplies and the other offer better prices for them, while another might prioritize weaponry. Universally, however, skill books and recipe pages were highly sought after, a valuable tip for your own scavenging runs. Another mechanic I find surprisingly enjoyable was the metal detector. While it doesn't allow you for complete random discoveries, it does add a layer of exploration. When you're near a buried cache, an icon will appear prompting you to activate the detector, and from there the interface displays a series of dots that guide you in the right direction. As you move, these dots will help you pinpoint the exact location, and once you're on top of the buried treasure, the detector flashes those lights. And a simple click or trigger pull unearths a container filled with valuable resources. It's a satisfying loop even if the initial discovery isn't entirely organic. Now, speaking about initial discoveries, the loot that you find in the world can be on shelves, on tables, but it also uses the opening container to loot mechanic as well. And while this isn't necessarily unique, having a sharp eye to look for items in the world while also looking for containers to open does make the game feel like you're truly scavenging in a world of survival. Moving on, beyond the exploration and the resource gathering, Atomfall features a distinctive RPG storyline. The narrative approach feels somewhat old school, reminiscent of classic RPGs. You're given a mission, often with a general area to investigate, but rarely a precise marker. This encourages you to venture out and explore, which ties you into the open worldish nature we discussed earlier. In your travels, you might stumble upon instance bunkers, hidden caves, or even just cryptic notes left behind, potentially leading to hidden stashes of loot. While this exploration driven by the story can be engaging for RPG enthusiasts, its direct contribution to the core survival mechanics feels somewhat limited. It's a layer on top, but not irrestrictly woven into the fight for daily existence. But the crafting system in Atomfall is present and functional, and you'll gather various resources like scrap metal, string, cloth, and more, and you'll learn recipes that allow you to combine these materials into useful items if you find or barter for them. However, despite playing through a significant portion of the game on the second highest difficulty setting, which is the recommended one I might say, I found myself barely utilizing the crafting system beyond a few essential items, primarily bandages for healing. It felt as though the crafting was more geared towards preparing for combat encounters, perhaps creating specific ammo types or protective gear, rather than the crucial lifeline for surviving the harsh environment itself. Even at higher difficulty, I rarely feel compelled to craft food or water because they don't exist as needs or other survival oriented tools in a significant way. While I appreciate the need to find recipes and gather materials, the impact of crafting on an overall survival experience felt underwhelming. It had the potential to be much more integral and a necessary system, but in its current state, it feels almost somewhat underutilized. One area where Atomfall does introduce a degree of survival consideration is the inventory management. You have a limited amount of space to carry your scavenged goods, and with the ability to equip 4 weapons to quick slots outside of that limited space, as well as ammunition and crafting items, thankfully not consuming those inventory slots as well. However, most other items outside guns, ammo, and crafting supplies do fill your inventory, forcing you to make strategic decisions about what to bring on your next excursion because your general inventory fills up relatively quickly. However, there is a separate world storage system using pneumatic tubes you can find around the world to help you store all those excess items. This limitation, while sometimes a minor inconvenience, does contribute to a slight sense of survival. You can't simply hoard every item you come across. You need to consider, do I have enough first aid, enough bandages, should I prioritize grenades over items to sell? Do I need to carry an atom battery to power specific devices? These considerations, born from limited inventory, add a subtle layer of resource management that aligns with the survival genre. Combat in Ampfall, particularly the gunplay and ammunition system, presents an interesting dynamic. The approach to combat feels relatively realistic. A well-placed headshot, even with a low-caliber weapon, is often lethal against unarmored targets. This emphasis on player skill and precision is something I appreciate. However, while ammunition can be somewhat scarce, making individual shots count and combat encounters more intense, the scarcity primarily affects the difficulty of combat rather than the fundamental challenge of surviving the environment outside of these encounters, such as hunting or trying to maintain your needs like other survival games do. The condition of your firearms does play a role though. Weapons range from heavily rusted to relatively well maintained, and this affects their performance. A fully rusted weapon might lack the stability or faster reloads of a more clean model. This adds a layer of realism and encourages you to seek out better quality weapons in less rusted state. While these elements don't contribute to a more grounded and engaging combat experience, they don't necessarily translate into a significantly harsher survival challenge in a broader sense. Perhaps the most significant aspect that pushes Atomfall away from the traditional survival genre is the absence of core survival mechanics like hunger and thirst. I will state that not all survival games require as a need, but this omission in Atomfall fundamentally changes the moment-to-moment survival gameplay loop, where constant resource procurement and management are paramount. Similarly, the environmental hazards in Atomfall feel minimal and often relegated to specific later game areas. I rarely encounter random pockets of radiation or other environmental dangers that pose an immediate threat during my exploration. Any areas with environmental challenges seem to be gated behind story progression or didn't offer enough compelling rewards to warrant the risk early on. While the world looks bleak, it doesn't actually feel like it's constantly trying to off me through its environment in the way a dedicated survival game often does. Even the act of eating food, which is present, serves solely to restore health, a common mechanic in countless open world RPGs that don't identify as survival. The absence of these fundamental needs makes the survival label feel somewhat tacked on. It's important to acknowledge the aspect of Atomfall that it does well. The visual storytelling is quite effective. The world is beautifully rendered with a palpable sense of decay and mystery. Exploring the remnants of the area you're stuck in, piecing together what happened through environmental details and scattered note is genuinely engaging. The interiors of building are often detailed and immersive, hinting at the lives that were once lived there. Even the inhabitants of this ravaged world, while often hostile, don't always conform to the stereotypic image of a post apocalyptic survivors in rags. Some groups, like bandits, have a distinct and even organized aesthetic, suggesting a world where some semblance of order, however brutal, has begun to re emerge. This nuance in the world building and character design adds to the overall atmosphere. So, after over 10 hours braving the wastes of Atomfall, where do I stand on the survival spectrum? Ultimately, I have to label Atomfall as a diet survival game. It incorporates enough elements reminiscent of the genre, crafting, scavenging, limited inventory, hostile environments, to perhaps warrant the label. However, the absence of the core mechanics like hunger and thirst or other basic needs, coupled with the other survival adjacent features are implemented, makes the survival aspect feel more like a thematic backdrop than a demanding core gameplay loop. When you consider the vast landscape of survival games, from the cozy and forgiving to the brutally hardcore, Atomfall leans heavily towards the RPG side of the spectrum that with survival undertones. In conclusion, Atomfall isn't a bad game by any means. In fact, approached as an open world RPG with survival elements, it has its merits and it's a great game. However, you're coming into it expecting it to be a deep and challenging survival experience in the vein that truly emphasizes the struggle, you might find yourself wanting more. It lands in the middle ground, not amazing, not terrible, just average, especially when viewed through the lens of a survival game enthusiast. These are just my initial impressions after a significant chunk of playtime. Now, I want to hear from you again. What are your thoughts on Atomfall? Do you agree with my assessment? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this analysis, be sure to like and subscribe for the video, and for more in-depth survival games, make sure to check us out. Ta-ta for now.